A gloved hand caught Lisette before she crashed into the marble staircase, but the force of the turn sent her straight against the stranger standing behind him, and the entire royal ballroom fell silent the instant her lips brushed the corner of the man's face beneath his half-mask. Music continued somewhere in the distance, yet nobody moved. Lisette stepped back so quickly that her shoe caught in the edge of her gown. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as whispers spread through the hall like fire racing through dry fields. She had never seen the man before, but every noble near the staircase suddenly lowered their eyes as though they feared even looking at him. Then the stranger lifted his gaze, cold, controlled, beautiful enough to unsettle a room, the kind of man mothers warned their daughters about in quiet voices. A single silver seal rested on his glove, and the moment Lisette noticed it, her stomach turned. Only one household in the kingdom carried that mark. The Duke of Gloucester, the ruthless Duke who ruined men without raising his voice. The Duke no lady dared approach willingly. The Duke is rumoured to have rejected every noblewoman in court, and she had just humiliated herself before him at the royal ball. But what frightened Lisette most was not the silence around them. It was the strange look that crossed the Duke's face before he slowly reached for the ribbon she had dropped beside him. Tell me honestly, before we continue, if you were Lisette, would you run from the Duke or face him after this disaster? I truly want to know your answer. So leave your thoughts and tell me which beautiful part of the world you are watching from. And if you enjoy emotional royal romances filled with secrets, betrayal, and impossible love, stay with us because this story becomes far more dangerous after tonight. Lisa could still feel the warmth of the Duke's glove against her fingertips long after she fled from the ballroom staircase. She hurried through the crowded hall while nobles whispered behind their fans and gentlemen exchanged amused looks across crystal goblets. Every step made her face burn hotter. The royal orchestra continued playing as though nothing disastrous had happened, yet the entire court had witnessed her stumble directly into the most feared man in the kingdom. Her older cousin, Malin, seized her wrist beside a row of marble pillars. "What have you done?" she whispered sharply. "Do you understand whose face you touched?" Lisette pulled her hand free and forced herself to breathe steadily. It was an accident. Accidents do not happen near the Duke of Gloucester. The name alone tightened the air around them. Lisette had heard stories about him since childhood. Servants claimed he dismissed household staff for lying with a single glance. Merchants trembled when his carriage stopped before their doors. Mothers warned reckless daughters that the Duke destroyed reputations faster than storms destroyed harvests. Yet none of those stories matched the man she had seen near the staircase. He had not looked furious. That was what unsettled her most. His gaze had rested on her with quiet attention, almost curious, before he bent to retrieve her fallen ribbon. Malin quickly adjusted Lisette's sleeve. "We are leaving before he notices you again." Across the ballroom, laughter suddenly vanished. The grand doors opened. Every noble immediately stepped aside as the Duke of Gloucester crossed the hall with measured calm. Candlelight flickered across the silver embroidery near his collar. Several ladies lowered their eyes the instant he passed them. Lisette understood why. The Duke carried silence with him, like a shadow. He was handsome in a severe way, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to uncover every hidden thought in the room. Nothing about him appeared careless. Even his calmness felt dangerous. Then his gaze found her again. The orchestra faltered for half a second. Malin nearly dragged Lisette backward. "Do not look at him." Too late. The Duke stopped directly before them. No one nearby dared breathe loudly. Lisette lowered into a proper curtsy, though her hands shook slightly beneath her gloves. "Your Grace." The Duke studied her for a moment before extending something toward her. Her ribbon. "You dropped this?" His voice was deep and controlled, yet softer than she expected. Lisette carefully accepted the ribbon. "Thank you, Your Grace." "You fled rather quickly." Heat rushed into her cheeks again. "I feared I had offended you." A faint expression crossed his face, gone before she understood it. "If I were offended, Lady Lisette, the entire ballroom would already know." Her pulse skipped. She had never introduced herself. The Duke turned slightly toward Malin. "Your cousin appears distressed." Malin forced a brittle smile. "Only surprised, Your Grace." "Understandable." The Duke's eyes returned to Lisette again, steady and unreadable. Then a young lord approached hurriedly from the crowd. "Your Grace, the Prince requests your presence." Without another word, the Duke inclined his head toward Lisette and walked away. The tension vanished the instant he disappeared into the circle of nobles near the throne platform. Malin released a long breath. "You must avoid him for the remainder of the evening." Lisette nodded, though uncertainty already settled heavily inside her chest. Because, despite everything people claimed about the Duke, she could not forget the strange restraint in his eyes. The royal ball stretched deeper into the night. Nobles danced beneath golden chandeliers while servants carried trays of sugared fruits and sparkling wines through the hall. Lisa tried to focus on ordinary conversation, yet whispers about the staircase incident continued following her everywhere. She nearly kissed him. The Duke did not even rebuke her. Perhaps he recognized her family. That makes it worse. Lisette finally escaped onto the palace terrace for air. Cold night wind swept across the marble balcony. Beyond the gardens, lanterns glowed along the distant river, while music drifted faintly through the open doors behind her. She gripped the stone railing tightly. "You look as though you regret attending tonight." Lisette spun around. The Duke of Norcester stood near the terrace entrance. She had not heard him approach. For one dangerous second, neither of them spoke. Then Lisette straightened carefully. "Your Grace should not wander alone. People already fear you enough." To her shock, amusement briefly touched his expression. "And you do not?" "I am trying not to." The Duke stepped closer, though still leaving respectful distance between them. "That sounds exhausting." Lisette almost smiled before catching herself. This was precisely how foolish young ladies ruined themselves. The Duke watched her silently for a moment. "Why did you truly run from the staircase?" "You already know why." "I would rather hear your answer." Lisette hesitated, because the truth sounded ridiculous. "I thought you might hate me for embarrassing you publicly." The Duke looked toward the ballroom lights behind them. "Most people fear me because of my title. You feared me because you believed you had inconvenienced me." "That is different." "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." Before Lisette could respond, hurried footsteps interrupted them. A tall woman in jeweled gloves emerged onto the terrace, with visible irritation hardening her face. Several noblewomen followed behind her like obedient shadows. Lisette immediately recognized her. Lady Iselle Marrowden, one of the wealthiest women in court, and the lady most determined to marry the Duke. Her sharp gaze moved between Lisette and the Duke. "How unusual," Lady Iselle said smoothly. "I did not realize private meetings were occurring outside the ballroom tonight." Lisette stepped back at once. This was not planned. Of course not. The insult beneath the words landed clearly. The Duke's expression cooled instantly. "Lady Iselle." The warning in his voice silenced the women behind her, yet Lady Iselle continued smiling. "His Majesty has been searching for you, Your Grace." The Duke never looked away from Lisette. "Then I should not keep the king waiting." He inclined his head once before leaving the terrace. Lady Iselle remained behind. The pleasant mask vanished from her face the moment the Duke disappeared. "You should be careful," she murmured. Lisette frowned slightly. "I have done nothing improper. You stood alone with him, after already drawing attention tonight. That is improper enough." Lise felt anger rise inside her chest. "The Duke approached me, not the reverse." Lady Iselle's eyes hardened further. "Then you should pray he loses interest quickly. Women who attract powerful men rarely survive court gossip intact." She swept away before Lisette could answer. The night no longer felt beautiful after that. By the time Lisette returned home with Maelin near dawn, exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders. Their carriage rolled through narrow streets, lined with sleeping shops and dim lanterns. Rain clouds gathered over the city rooftops, while distant thunder murmured across the sky. Maelin kept glancing toward Lisette anxiously. "You cannot allow this situation to continue." "There is no situation." "There will be if the Duke seeks you again." Lisette stared through the carriage window. Deep inside, she already suspected he would. The next morning proved her correct. A servant entered the breakfast room carrying a sealed black envelope. Every conversation stopped instantly. Lisette's aunt nearly dropped her teacup. "Who delivered that?" The messenger wore the Norcester crest. Silence swallowed the room. Maelin slowly turned toward Lisette. "Open it." With unsteady fingers, Lisette broke the seal. Inside rested a single invitation, written in elegant handwriting. "The Duke of Norcester requests Lady Lisette Valamere's presence at Blackthorn Manor for dinner 3 nights from now." Nothing more. No explanation. No apology. No reason at all. Her aunt looked horrified. "You cannot accept." Maelin looked equally alarmed. "If you refuse, the insult could spread through court." Lisette read the invitation again. Blackthorn Manor. The Duke almost never invited guests there. Rumours claimed the estate remained silent for years after his parents died. Others whispered that no woman had ever crossed its gates twice. Thunder cracked loudly outside the windows. Lisette folded the letter carefully, while unease coiled through her stomach. Because, suddenly, the accidental kiss at the royal ball no longer felt like a mistake. It felt like the beginning of something far more dangerous. The Duke no longer felt distant to Lisette. "Now tell me honestly, do you think the Duke invited Lisette because he is intrigued by her? Or is he hiding another reason entirely? And should Lisette accept the invitation to Blackthorn Manor after all the warnings surrounding him?" I will be reading through the comments carefully to see whose predictions are correct before we continue. Rain struck the carriage roof steadily as Lisette travelled toward Blackthorn Manor 3 nights later, while every warning she had heard about the Duke of Norcester returned to trouble her thoughts. Maelin sat across from her with folded hands and an expression filled with concern that deepened whenever thunder rolled across the dark countryside. "You still have time to turn back," Maelin murmured. Lisette adjusted the gloves covering her trembling fingers. "Refusing him now would create more scandal than attending. That depends on what happens after you arrive." The carriage continued through iron gates, taller than any Lisette had ever seen. Massive stone statues lined the winding path toward the estate, their weathered faces staring coldly through the rain. Blackthorn Manor finally emerged through the storm, like something pulled from an old legend. Tall windows glowed faintly behind sheets of falling rain, while torchlight flickered against towering walls covered in ivy. Lisette suddenly understood why the estate carried such a fearful reputation. The manor did not resemble a home. It resembled a fortress guarding secrets. A servant opened the carriage door before Maelin could speak again. "We will wait for you," her cousin whispered urgently. "If anything feels wrong, leave immediately." Lisette nodded, though uncertainty tightened painfully inside her chest. The servants inside Blackthorn Manor moved with unsettling silence. Long corridors stretched beneath shadowed chandeliers, while portraits of stern ancestors covered nearly every wall. None of the painted faces appeared welcoming. A grey-haired butler finally stopped before towering double doors. "His Grace is waiting." The doors opened slowly. Lisette stepped into a vast library, warmed by crackling firelight. Shelves filled with leather-bound books climbed toward the high ceiling, while rain tapped softly against tall windows overlooking dark gardens. The Duke of Norcester stood beside the fireplace, with one hand resting behind his back. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Then the Duke crossed the room calmly. "You accepted my invitation despite the rumors surrounding this house. That was either brave or reckless." "Perhaps both." A faint hint of approval appeared in his eyes. "You seem less afraid tonight." Lisette removed her gloves carefully. "That may change depending on why you invited me here." The Duke gestured toward the dining chamber beyond the library. "Then allow me to explain before court gossip invents reasons for us." Dinner had already been prepared inside a candle-lit chamber overlooking the estate gardens. Silver utensils gleamed beside polished crystal, while servants waited motionlessly near the walls. Yet despite the elegance surrounding them, tension lingered heavily between Lisette and the Duke from the instant they sat across from one another. "You have become popular at court this week," the Duke remarked. "That is not a compliment." "No, it rarely is." Lisette studied him carefully. "You knew inviting me here would worsen the gossip." "I did." "Then why do it?" The Duke lifted his glass slightly before setting it down untouched. "Because I dislike cowardice, and fleeing from rumors only strengthens them. That still does not explain your interest in me." His gaze held hers steadily. "You are one of the few people who speak honestly in my presence." The answer unsettled her more than she expected. Before she could respond, another voice suddenly interrupted from the doorway. "How disappointing." Lisette turned sharply. Lady Orsell stood near the entrance, with a stern older woman beside her. Rain glittered across their cloaks, while visible displeasure hardened their expressions. The Duke rose slowly from his seat. "You arrived earlier than expected." Lady Azelle ignored him entirely while studying Lisette. "So the rumors were true after all." The older woman beside her spoke coldly. "Your Grace, the court already questions your judgment. Entertaining an unmarried lady privately inside this estate will only encourage further scandal." Lisette immediately stood. "I did not realize other guests were expected. I can leave at once." "You will remain seated," the Duke said calmly. The command silenced the room instantly. Lady Iselle stepped closer. "Must you embarrass our families publicly for this stranger?" The Duke's expression hardened. "Lady Lisette is my guest." "And what exactly does that mean?" Several dangerous seconds passed before the Duke answered. "It means you will address her respectfully while inside my home." The temperature inside the chamber seemed to drop immediately. Lady Iselle looked stunned by the rebuke. The older woman beside her appeared equally alarmed. Lisette suddenly realized something important. The Duke almost never defended anyone publicly, yet he had just defended her without hesitation. Lady Iselle's composure finally cracked. "You barely know this woman." The Duke never looked away from her. "That has not stopped you from discussing her across half the kingdom." Silence followed. Then Lady Iselle turned sharply toward Lisette. "You should understand something clearly. Powerful men often enjoy temporary distractions before arranging respectable marriages elsewhere." Lisette met her gaze evenly, despite the humiliation burning inside her chest. Then it is fortunate I didn't come here expecting marriage. Unexpected amusement flickered across the Duke's face again. Lady Ezelle noticed it immediately, and fury darkened her expression further. Without another word, she swept from the dining chamber while the older woman hurried after her. The heavy doors slammed behind them. Lisette released a slow breath. "I believe your evening has become significantly worse because of me." The Duke resumed his seat calmly. "No. Lady Ezelle has behaved this way for years. She wishes to marry you. So the kingdom constantly reminds me." Lisette hesitated before speaking carefully. "Why have you never accepted anyone?" The Duke grew quiet. Firelight shifted across his features, while distant thunder echoed beyond the manor walls. Finally, he answered softly. "Because affection becomes dangerous when people learn how to use it against you." Something about the sadness beneath his voice caught Lisette unexpectedly off guard. Before she could reply, shouting suddenly erupted, somewhere deep within the manor. The Duke rose immediately. Another servant burst through the doors, looking pale with panic. "Your Grace, there has been an accident in the West Wing." The Duke moved quickly through the corridors with Lisette following, despite the servants urging her to remain behind. Smoke already drifted faintly through the upper hallway, while frightened maids hurried toward staircases carrying buckets of water. "What happened?" the Duke demanded. A lantern overturned inside the storage chamber. They reached the West Wing moments later. Smoke thickened heavily near the ceiling, while servants struggled to contain flames spreading along wooden shelves inside a locked room. Then Lisette heard it. A child crying. Her heart lurched violently. "Someone is inside." One terrified maid nodded tearfully. "The stable boy's little sister. We cannot reach her." Before anyone stopped her, Lisette rushed toward the smoke-filled chamber. "Lady Lisette!" several servants shouted. The Duke caught her wrist before she reached the doorway. "You will not enter alone." Heat from the growing fire pressed against them, while smoke curled through the corridor. Then the Duke wrapped part of his coat across Lisette's mouth and entered the room beside her. Inside, flames climbed rapidly along old curtains, while shattered lantern oil spread across the floor. The frightened child crouched behind a fallen chair near the back wall, crying uncontrollably. Lisette hurried carefully toward her, despite the smoke burning her eyes. "It is all right," she whispered gently. "We are taking you out." The child clung tightly to her, the instant Lisette lifted her into her arms. A loud crack suddenly split through the chamber. The Duke pulled Lisette backward, just as burning wood crashed onto the floor beside them. For one terrifying moment, Lisette lost her balance against the smoke and confusion surrounding them. Then the Duke steadied her firmly, before guiding both her and the child safely through the flames toward the corridor. Servants rushed forward immediately after they escaped. The little girl was quickly carried away, while exhausted relief spread across the hallway. Lisette struggled for breath as soot darkened her gloves and sleeves. The Duke studied her with visible disbelief. "You ran into a burning room for someone you had never met." She was frightened. "You could have died." "So could she?" The Duke stared at her silently while smoke drifted through the corridor between them. Something shifted in his expression then. Not curiosity, not amusement. Something deeper. Something far more dangerous. And for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Manor, Lisette realized she might no longer be the only person unsettled by their growing connection. Meanwhile, beyond the darkened corridor, unseen eyes watched the Duke and Lisette, together with growing resentment and dangerous patience, tonight silently. "Now tell me honestly, do you believe the Duke is beginning to care for Lisette already? Or is he simply fascinated because she behaves differently from every noblewoman around him. And after the fire inside Blackthorn Manor, do you think somebody caused the accident intentionally? I will be checking every comment closely before we continue, because some of your predictions may be far more accurate than you expect. Lysette barely slept after the fire at Blackthorn Manor. Even after returning home before dawn, the smell of smoke clung to her gloves and hair, while memories of the burning corridor continued chasing through her thoughts. Each time she closed her eyes, she remembered the Duke pulling her away from falling timber, while flames roared around them. By morning, the entire kingdom had already heard exaggerated versions of the incident. Some claimed the Duke carried Lysette from the fire like a devoted lover. Others insisted the blaze began because jealous rivals wished to ruin her reputation before she could secure the Duke's favor. Servants repeated stories so wildly that even the palace guards argued over what truly happened inside Blackthorn Manor. Lysette remained seated near the drawing-room window, while rain slid softly against the glass. Malin paced restlessly nearby. This is becoming dangerous. You have said that every day this week, because every day becomes worse. A servant suddenly entered, carrying another sealed letter, marked with the Norcester crest. Malin groaned softly. Again? Lysette accepted the letter carefully and opened it beneath her cousin's anxious stare. Meet me at St. Orlan's Conservatory before sunset. Come alone. There was no signature. None was needed. Malin looked horrified after reading the message. Absolutely not. He likely wishes to discuss the fire. He likely wishes to drag you deeper into scandal. Lysette folded the letter slowly. Then I will hear his explanation before deciding whether to avoid him forever. Malin stared at her in disbelief. You are beginning to care about him. Lysette immediately looked away. That silence alone answered the accusation. Before sunset arrived, Lysette travelled quietly towards St. Orlan's Conservatory, hidden behind the royal gardens. The old glass structure had once belonged to a queen who filled it with rare flowers collected from distant kingdoms. Most nobles ignored the place now, because newer gardens surrounded the palace grounds, yet the conservatory remained beautiful beneath the fading evening light. The Duke already waited inside among rows of climbing ivy and candle-lit lanterns. You came, he said. You sounded urgent. His expression darkened slightly. The fire was not an accident. Cold unease spread through Lysette's chest. You are certain? One of my servants discovered lantern oil poured deliberately across the storage chamber floor. Lysette's stomach tightened painfully. Who would do such a thing? That is what I intend to discover. The Duke moved closer while lowering his voice carefully. Until then, you must remain cautious. You believe someone wishes to harm me. I believe someone wishes to use you against me. The honesty in his answer frightened her more than any comforting lie could have. Lysette studied him quietly. Why are you telling me this personally? Because I do not trust written correspondence anymore. A branch scraped softly against the glass ceiling overhead, while tension settled between them again. Then the Duke spoke more quietly. You should not have entered that fire. You already told me that. And you ignored me. I could not leave that child alone. For the first time since meeting him, frustration broke through his controlled calm. You risk yourself too easily. Lysette lifted her chin slightly. Perhaps you are simply unused to people protecting others without expecting rewards. The Duke fell silent immediately. Regret touched her at once. She had crossed a line. But instead of anger, something wounded flickered briefly across his face before disappearing beneath composure once more. You may be correct, he admitted softly. The answer caught her entirely off guard. Before Lysette could respond, hurried footsteps echoed from outside the conservatory. A young servant rushed through the entrance looking terrified. "Your Grace, there has been trouble at Valemere House." Lisette's blood ran cold. "What happened?" The servant struggled for breath. Several men forced their way onto the estate grounds. Your aunt ordered the gates locked, but one stable was set ablaze before the guards stopped them. Fear crashed through Lisette violently. "My family. They are alive," the servant assured quickly, "but your aunt requested you return immediately." Tria. Duke's expression hardened into something deadly calm. Within minutes, his carriage thundered through the darkening streets toward Valemere House. Lisette gripped the seat tightly, while dread twisted deeper with every passing moment. When they finally arrived, smoke still drifted from the damaged stable, while frightened servants hurried across the courtyard carrying buckets of water. Malin rushed toward Lisette the instant she stepped from the carriage. "You are safe. What happened here?" One of the guards recognized the intruders before they escaped. Malin lowered her voice shakily. "They wore the crest of House Marrowden. Lady Iselle." Lisette felt shock and anger collide inside her chest. The Duke stood beside the burning stable, while several guards spoke urgently around him. Firelight sharpened the cold fury across his face, so severely that nearby servants avoided looking directly at him. A wounded stable hand approached nervously. "Your Grace, one of the attackers left this behind." He handed over a silver ring engraved with the Marrowden family seal. The Duke closed his hand around it slowly. Lisette moved toward him carefully. "Do you truly believe Lady Iselle ordered this?" "No," he answered quietly. Relief barely touched her before he continued. "I believe someone wishes us to think she did." That realization deepened the danger surrounding them instantly. The Duke turned toward one of his guards. "Double security around this estate tonight. Nobody enters without my permission." Lisette frowned. "You cannot remain here personally." "I can. You are a duke. The court already watches every movement you make. And yet your home was attacked only hours after I warned you to remain cautious." The sharp edge beneath his voice silenced her. Rain began falling again, while servants extinguished the remaining flames nearby. Then another carriage suddenly approached the estate gates. Lady Iselle herself stepped out moments later, wearing a furious expression. "I was informed my family name was connected to this disgrace," she snapped, while storming across the courtyard. "Explain immediately." The Duke held up the silver ring. For the first time since Lisette met her, genuine shock crossed Lady Iselle's face. "That ring belongs to my brother." "Where is he tonight?" the Duke asked coldly. "At a hunting lodge north of the city." "Can anyone confirm that?" Lady Iselle's anger sharpened instantly. "Are you accusing my family of attacking a noble household?" "I am investigating." She looked toward Lisette with visible resentment. "Ever since this woman entered your life, disaster follows behind her." Lisette stiffened, but the Duke answered before she could speak. "Careful, Lady Iselle." The warning carried enough danger to quiet the courtyard. Lady Iselle stared at him for several painful seconds before speaking more softly. "You defend her as though she already belongs to you." The Duke never looked away from her. "That is none of your concern." Those words changed everything. Even the servant standing nearby understood it immediately. Lady Iselle's expression cracked with humiliation before fury replaced it entirely. Without another word, she turned sharply and disappeared back into her carriage. Lisette watched her leave with growing unease. "You should not have spoken to her that way publicly. She threatened you. She is still powerful. So am I." The quiet certainty beneath his answer sent tension rushing through her chest again. Hours later, after guards secured the estate, the Duke finally prepared to leave. Lisette walked with him toward the front entrance, while lantern light flickered softly across the wet stone steps. "You believe someone is deliberately forcing our lives together," she murmured. "Yes." "And if they succeed?" The Duke studied her silently before answering. "Then neither of us will leave this untouched." His words lingered heavily between them. Then he reached into his coat and placed something carefully into her hand, her ribbon from the royal ball. The same ribbon that began everything. "I kept it longer than intended," he admitted quietly. Lisette looked up slowly, startled by the unexpected confession. The Duke stepped back toward his carriage before speaking again. "Lock your windows tonight." Then he disappeared into the storm. Inside her chamber later, that night, Lisette placed the ribbon beside her candle and admitted the truth she had resisted for days. The Duke no longer felt like a stranger from the ball. Somehow, against reason, he had become impossible to ignore. But inside the shadows beyond Valamir House, another figure watched the departing carriage with dangerous patience while gripping a hidden dagger tightly beneath a rain-soaked cloak. And this time, the threat stalking Lisette was far closer than anyone imagined. Now tell me honestly, who do you think is secretly targeting Lisette and the Duke together? Do you trust Lady Iselle after tonight, or do you believe somebody else is manipulating both families from the shadows? And why do you think the Duke kept Lisette's ribbon all this time? Drop your comments. I want to know your thoughts. The storm over the capital had not lifted by morning, and Lisette woke to the sound of distant thunder rolling across the rooftops like a warning that refused to fade. Every corner of Valamir House felt tighter than before, as though the walls themselves had begun to remember too many secrets at once. Servants moved more cautiously, guards stood closer to the gates, and Malin refused to leave Lisette's side even for a moment. Yet what unsettled Lisette most was not the fear lingering after the attack, but the absence of any new message from the Duke of Gloucester. After everything that had happened, silence felt more dangerous than words. Malin finally broke the uneasy quiet during breakfast, placing a folded notice beside Lisette's plate without speaking. The seal was unfamiliar, yet the wax bore a sharp emblem of a hawk gripping a broken chain. Lisette frowned as she opened it. An invitation to attend the Crown Assembly's private observance at the Capitol Hall had been extended to her name alone, without explanation. Malin leaned forward instantly. "That is not ordinary court etiquette. Why would they request you? I do not know, and yet it is signed by the royal chamber." Lisette set the letter down slowly, unease tightening in her chest again. "I did not ask to be involved in court affairs." "But you already are," Malin replied firmly. "Ever since the fire, everything around you has changed." By midday, word arrived that the Duke of Gloucester himself had entered the royal district, and the capital reacted as though a blade had been drawn inside a quiet room. Noble carriages slowed in every street he passed, merchants lowered their shutters, and even the palace guards adjusted their formation without command. Lisette watched from the upper corridor window as his carriage passed beneath the iron gates of Valamir grounds. He did not come inside. He did not send a message. He simply stopped long enough for the carriage window to face her direction. And then he looked up. The moment felt brief, yet it pressed against Lisette's thoughts, long after the carriage moved away. Malin noticed her expression immediately. "You should not be watching for him," Malin warned softly. "I am not waiting for him." "Then why do you look disappointed when he leaves?" Lisette had no answer that satisfied either of them. That evening, the royal invitation could no longer be ignored. Against Malin's protests, Lisette travelled under guarded escort toward the Capitol Hall, where the Crown Assembly gathered in rare private observance. The building rose from the centre of the city like a monument to authority, its tall arches carved with symbols of old treaties and forgotten wars. Inside, nobles filled the marble chamber in carefully arranged order, their conversations low but sharp. Lisette moved through them carefully, feeling every gaze linger longer than necessary. Then the atmosphere changed again. The Duke of Norcester entered. Silence followed him instantly. No announcement was needed. No guard directed attention. Every noble simply turned as if drawn by instinct they could not resist. Lisette found herself standing still before she realized it. He walked past the gathered court without acknowledging anyone until his gaze reached her. For the briefest moment, the noise of the hall disappeared entirely. Then he stopped beside her. "You came," he said quietly. "I had no choice." "There is always a choice." Lisette met his gaze more steadily than before. "Then I chose to understand why I was summoned." Something unreadable passed across his expression before he looked toward the assembly platform. The royal chamber doors opened again, and a senior court herald stepped forward, holding a sealed decree. The entire hall fell into rigid silence as the parchment was unrolled. "The Crown hereby requests the presence of Lady Lisette Valamer," the herald announced, "in matters concerning national security and noble jurisdiction." A ripple of shock moved through the chamber. Lisette's breath caught sharply. National security? Malin, standing several rows behind her, looked equally stunned. The Duke did not react outwardly, but Lisette noticed the faint tightening in his jaw. Before she could ask anything further, a second decree was read aloud. "And the Duke of Norcester is hereby appointed overseer of inquiry regarding recent disturbances affecting noble estates and royal trade routes." A murmur broke across the hall. Lisette turned toward him immediately. "You were not told of this beforehand?" "No," he answered simply. The implication settled heavily between them. They were being placed together under royal command. After the assembly dismissed the gathering, Lisette found herself walking alongside the Duke through a private corridor, lined with tall windows overlooking the city. Rain streaked the glass in uneven patterns, while lanterns below flickered like scattered embers. "This is not a coincidence," Lisette said quietly. "No," the Duke agreed. "Someone arranged it." "Yes." Lisette stopped walking. "Then we are being guided toward something we do not understand." The Duke turned slightly toward her. "Or someone is guiding us toward each other for a reason." The words unsettled her more than she expected. Before she could respond, a palace messenger hurried toward them, carrying an urgent scroll. The Duke opened it first, his expression darkening as he read. "What is it?" Lisette asked. "The investigation has already begun," he said slowly. "And according to this report, another noble estate was set ablaze last night." Lisette felt her stomach drop. "Where?" "House Valcrest." She had heard of it. A smaller but influential family, known for controlling trade records in the northern provinces. Malin's voice echoed in Lisette's memory suddenly. "Everything around you has changed." The Duke handed the scroll back to the messenger. "This is not random." Lisette's voice lowered. "Someone is targeting estates connected through influence or knowledge." "Yes. And using fire." The Duke looked at her directly. "Or using fear." A distant bell rang across the capital, signaling the changing of guards, yet neither of them moved. Instead, Lisette noticed something she had not seen before in him. Not control, not distance, but calculation layered with something almost like concern. "You believe I am part of this pattern?" she said carefully. "I believe someone is making you central to it." The answer should have frightened her more than anything else. Yet instead, it left her strangely focused. That night, Lisette returned home only to find Malin waiting near the entrance with pale urgency. "Another letter arrived while you were gone." Lisette opened it immediately. No seal, no signature. Only a single line, written in uneven ink. The next fire will not miss. Her hands trembled slightly as she lowered the paper. Malin read it, and immediately ordered the doors locked. Guards were doubled, servants dismissed early, and every lantern inside Valamir House was checked twice. Yet Lisette could not escape the feeling that security no longer mattered, because somewhere within the capital, someone already knew exactly where she was at every moment. Later that night, as silence settled over the estate, Lisette stood near her window, watching the rain fall harder than before. She thought of the Duke again, of the way he had stood beside her, without hesitation, of the way he spoke as though danger followed logic rather than chance. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Malin entered, holding a sealed envelope. "This was delivered without a messenger," she said. Lisette opened it slowly. Inside was a simple drawing of the royal ball staircase. 2 figures stood beneath it. One of them was her, the other was the Duke, and above them, written in precise ink, were the words, "The moment you touched him, you became part of his curse." Lisette stepped back slightly, breath tightening. Malin noticed immediately. "What does it say?" Lisette did not answer right away, because for the first time, she realized the danger was not only around them, it was built into their connection itself, and somewhere in the capital, the person behind the fires was no longer hiding quietly. They were watching, waiting, and preparing something far worse than anyone had imagined. Now tell me honestly, do you think the curse mentioned in the letter is real, or is it a way to manipulate Lisette into abandoning the Duke? And who do you suspect is orchestrating the fires across the noble estates? The drawing arrived like a wound reopening itself. Lisette could not move for several moments after Malin placed it into her hands, as though the inked image carried weight beyond paper. The royal staircase from the ball was drawn with unsettling accuracy, each carved step and arch reproduced with patient precision. Beneath it stood 2 figures, one unmistakably her, the other unmistakably the Duke of Norcester, positioned so close that the space between them felt intentionally erased. But what froze her more than the illustration was the line written beneath it. "The moment you touched him, you became part of his curse." Malin paced behind her with a growing alarm. This is no ordinary threat. Someone has been watching you both since the royal ball. Lisette lowered the paper slowly. Then it began before the fires, before the attack on Valamir, before anything we thought connected us. Malin stopped pacing. "You believe the Duke is involved?" Lisette hesitated only briefly. "No. I believe someone is using his name as a shadow to hide behind." The night deepened further as guards inspected every corridor of Valamir House, yet Lisette felt no safer. Instead, every flicker of lantern light seemed to stretch into something watchful. Even the rain outside struck the windows like impatient fingers. Far across the capital, within the sealed chambers of an abandoned estate, a woman stood before a wall filled with clipped documents and painted sketches. Her name was Idrissa Halvan, once a respected strategist within noble circles before her exile for crimes never publicly spoken aloud. She traced her fingers across the same staircase sketch that had been delivered to Lisette, her expression tightening with quiet satisfaction. "The pieces are aligning," she murmured to herself. "Soon even the Duke will not recognize which truth belongs to him." Back at Valamir House, Lisette finally made a decision before dawn. She would not remain a passive target. If someone was shaping events around her, she needed to understand the pattern rather than fear it. When Malin tried to stop her from leaving the next morning, Lisette only shook her head gently. "I am going to Blackthorn Manor again," she said. Malin's face tightened. "After everything that has happened, you want to return there willingly." "I want answers, not distance. Then go with guards. If whoever is doing this wanted me dead, guards would not matter. Malin could not argue against that logic, though fear remained visible in her eyes. By midday, Lisette arrived once more at Blackthorn Manor, though this time the estate felt different. The silence was heavier, the corridors dimmer, as though the building itself had withdrawn from the world. The Duke met her inside the library without surprise, as if he had expected her arrival. "You came alone," he observed. "I was not followed." "That is not what I meant." Lisette stepped closer, holding the drawing carefully. "This arrived at my home." The Duke studied it without touching it. "Someone is escalating their message, or revealing their intention." His gaze lifted slightly. "You believe the curse is a constructed story." "I believe someone wants us to believe we are connected by fate so strongly that resisting becomes impossible." A faint approval appeared in his expression. "That is a dangerous conclusion, but a necessary one." The Duke turned toward the fireplace, considering her words. "Then we begin where manipulation often begins, with origin." That afternoon, they traveled together through restricted archives beneath Blackthorn Manor. The passageway was older than the rest of the estate, lined with stone shelves carved directly into the foundation. Dust hung in the air like suspended memory. Lisette ran her fingers along aged records, while the Duke searched opposite rows. "What are we looking for exactly?" she asked. "Any record of the staircase in the drawing?" "That could belong to the palace itself." "Yes," Lisette paused. "Then this is not about me alone." The Duke stopped briefly. "It never was." Hours passed before Lisette discovered a sealed file hidden behind a false panel. The paper inside was brittle, marked with an emblem she did not recognize immediately. The Duke stepped closer when she unfolded it. A royal reconstruction report of the palace staircase following an old incident involving structural collapse decades earlier. At the bottom of the document, a list of names recorded those involved in the original reconstruction committee. One name was crossed out violently: Idrissa Halvorn. Lisette looked up sharply. She was part of royal construction oversight. The Duke's expression darkened. She was removed after accusations of sabotage that were never fully proven. Sabotage what exactly? Multiple estates connected to noble logistics routes. The connection settled heavily between them. Fire, estates, trade routes, and now reconstruction records tied to the royal staircase itself. Lisette spoke quietly. Someone is continuing what she began, or someone is completing what she failed to finish. Before either of them could continue, distant footsteps echoed from the upper corridor. A servant entered hurriedly, breath uneven. "Your Grace, a message arrived from the palace. The Crown requests your immediate presence. Lady Lisette is also summoned." The Duke exchanged a brief look with her before nodding. Within hours they stood once again inside the royal hall, though this time the atmosphere felt more controlled, less ceremonial. A smaller circle of officials waited beneath dimmer chandeliers, including a royal adjudicator, whose presence signaled severity rather than formality. The adjudicator stepped forward. "Recent disturbances across noble estates have escalated beyond isolated incidents. Evidence suggests coordinated interference in both property destruction and court influence." Murmurs passed through the chamber. Then a sealed report was opened. The individual previously known as Idrissa Halvorn has been identified as a central figure in prior sabotage investigations. Lisette felt the name strike like cold metal. The adjudicator continued. "It is believed she may be operating under concealed identity, using misinformation to destabilize noble alliances." The Duke spoke immediately. "You are suggesting she is alive?" "We are suggesting the possibility, Your Grace. Lisette turned slightly toward the Duke. Do you believe it? His answer came after a brief pause. I believe someone is using her history to construct fear. The adjudicator then placed a final document on the table. Recovered correspondence indicating surveillance of Lady Lisette Valamer beginning weeks before the royal ball. Lisette's breath caught. The surveillance predates the staircase incident, the adjudicator said, which means the target was selected long before contact with the Duke. Silence filled the chamber. The implication was unavoidable. The Duke and Lisette had not been brought together by accident at the ball. They had been placed within reach of each other deliberately. After the assembly ended, Lisette and the Duke walked again through the palace corridors, but neither spoke for some time. Guards moved ahead and behind them, yet the space between them felt isolated from everything else. Finally, Lisette spoke. Someone planned for us to meet. Yes, and every event since then has pushed us closer together. The Duke stopped walking. Which means we are not just targets. Lisette finished the thought quietly. We are components in a design. A tense silence followed, before the Duke spoke again. Then we stop reacting and start tracing intention. That night, they returned separately to avoid further attention, yet Lisette could not sleep. She replayed every event since the royal ball, the accidental step, the fire, the invitations, the attacks, the drawing. Each moment now felt less like chaos and more like positioning. Near midnight, a servant rushed into Valamer House once again, pale with urgency. My lady, there is movement at the northern estate. Guards report a figure matching Idrissa Holvorn's description, seen near abandoned ruins outside the capital. Malin immediately turned toward Lisette. You cannot go. Lisette stood already. If she is real and not a myth, then she is close enough to answer questions we have been avoiding. Malin grabbed her arm. Or close enough to finish what she started. Lisette gently removed her hand. Then we do not meet her alone. Within an hour, Lisette arrived at the outskirts of the capital, accompanied by discreet royal guards, and, unexpectedly, the Duke himself, who had intercepted the message before she left. You were not meant to follow, she said. And yet I did. The ruins. Ahead rose from the darkness like broken teeth, remnants of an estate burned long ago. Wind moved through collapsed archways, while distant lantern light flickered between fractured walls. The Duke signaled the guards to remain back. You recognize this place, Lisette said. Yes. What is it? A site connected to the earliest reports of sabotage attributed to Idrissa Holvorn. A shadow moved within the ruins ahead. Both of them turned instantly. A woman stepped forward slowly from the darkness, her face partially concealed beneath a hood, her presence calm in a way that felt controlled rather than afraid. She stopped at a distance, where lantern light finally revealed her features. And she smiled. I wondered when the Duke would finally bring her here himself. Lisette's pulse tightened instantly. The Duke did not move. The woman's gaze shifted toward Lisette with quiet curiosity. You were never meant to survive the ball so untouched, she said softly. Yet here you stand, still breathing, still close to him. Lisette stepped forward slightly. Who are you? The woman tilted her head. I am the consequence of every secret the court tried to bury. The Duke's voice turned colder than Lisette had ever heard it. Idrissa Holvorn. The woman's smile widened faintly. Names are only useful when people still believe in them. Wind swept through the ruins as tension tightened around all three of them, and Lisette finally understood that whatever had been unfolding since the royal ball was no longer hidden in shadows. It had finally stepped into the open. Now tell me honestly, do you think Idrissa is acting alone, or is someone inside the royal court helping her shape everything? And why do you think she wanted Lisette alive until now instead of removing her early? I will be reading every comment carefully before we continue, because the truth is now closer than anyone in this story realizes. The ruins swallowed sound in a way that made every breath feel exposed, as if the night itself was listening. Lisette stood a few steps behind the Duke, while the woman who called herself Idrissa Halvorn remained still beneath fractured stone arches. Lantern light from the guards behind them barely reached her face, yet her presence felt sharper than any flame that had ever burned through the noble estates. The Duke did not move first. Neither did Lisette. It was Idrissa who broke the silence. "You brought her here expecting answers," she said softly. "But answers rarely arrive without cost." Lisette tightened her hands. "Then speak plainly." A faint smile touched Idrissa's lips. "You still think truth is something that can be spoken cleanly." The Duke's voice cut through the air. "You are meant to be dead." "Many people are meant to be many things," she replied. "The difference is whether anyone verifies it." Lisette stepped forward slightly. "The fires, the attacks, the letters. Was it all you?" Idrissa finally looked directly at her. "Not all." The answer unsettled the space more than denial would have. The Duke's gaze narrowed. "Then who else?" Idrissa walked slowly across the broken ground, her steps unhurried, despite the guards watching from a distance. "You both think this began with me, because my name appears in old reports. That is how the court prefers memory to function. Assign a villain, burn the pages, pretend the structure is safe again." Lisette felt the weight of Maylene's warnings, the drawing, the curse written across ink and fear. "You placed us together," Lisette said carefully. "Yes," Idrissa admitted. The Duke's expression hardened instantly. "At the royal ball. Long before that." The wind shifted through the ruins, carrying dust between them. Idrissa stopped walking. "The staircase, you remember, is not only stone. It is a point of alignment. Certain meetings in history are not accidental, even when they appear so." Lisette struggled to understand. "You engineered my invitation." "I influenced the conditions," Idrissa corrected. "But I didn't force your step. That belonged to you." The Duke's tone sharpened. "Why?" Idrissa's gaze shifted toward him now. "Because you were already being watched, Your Grace. Long before she ever touched your face at that ball." Silence tightened instantly. Lisette's mind returned to the invitation, the fire at Blackthorn, the estate attacks. "Someone else is behind this," she said slowly. Idrissa did not deny it. The Duke stepped forward now, closing distance dangerously. "Name them." For the first time, Idrissa's composure faltered slightly, not in fear, but in restraint. "You still believe names will save you," she said quietly. "They will not." Lisette looked between them. "If you wanted us apart, you could have done it in silence. Why guide us through everything instead?" Idrissa studied Lisette with a measured stillness that felt almost like recognition. "Because separation would have made you irrelevant," she said. "And irrelevance is the only protection you have left." The Duke's jaw tightened. "Protection from what?" Idrissa turned slightly toward the ruins behind her, where collapsed stone marked the remnants of an older structure buried beneath time. "From the one who designed your world long before either of you were born into it." Lisette felt a chill spread through her chest. The Duke's voice dropped lower. "Explain." Idrissa finally exhaled slowly. "There is a network inside the court that does not belong to any single house. It predates current titles. It feeds on alliances, weakens succession lines, and removes those who disrupt long-planned stability." Lisette's mind struggled to connect it. "A council." "Not a council," Idrissa corrected. "A correction system." The wind howled briefly through broken arches. Idrissa continued. Your estates were chosen because they connect trade routes, information channels, and royal influence points. The fires are not destruction. They are recalibration. The Duke's eyes darkened. And Lyset? Idrissa paused before answering. She is not at random proximity, she said finally. She is convergent. Lyset felt her breath tighten. I do not understand. You were marked, Idrissa said simply. Not by me. By them. The Duke turned slightly toward Lyset, his expression unreadable now in a different way. Lyset shook her head. That cannot be true. Your family records were accessed before the royal ball, Idrissa continued. Your movements are tracked. Your attendance is confirmed. Everything after that was guided toward proximity with him. The Duke spoke sharply. Why me? Idrissa looked at him fully now. Because you are the only Duke in the current court lineage who refused alignment with their structure. A tense silence followed. Lyset's voice softened slightly. So the curse letter. Idrissa nodded faintly. A distraction. A psychological fracture point. If you believe your connection is doomed, you will separate yourselves. That is what they want. The Duke's expression turned colder. And if we do not? Idrissa met his gaze without hesitation. Then you become unpredictable. The word lingered. Unpredictable. Lyset suddenly understood the pattern behind everything. Fire, accusation, rumor, invitation, court decree. Not chaos, pressure. The Duke spoke again, quieter now. You are telling us we are being shaped. Yes, and you expect us to trust you. Idrissa's smile returned faintly, but it carried something heavier now. I expect nothing, she said. I am already condemned by their structure. I am simply deciding which pieces fall before I do. A sudden sound echoed from deeper within the ruins, a low metallic shift, like gears moving beneath stone. Idrissa's head turned slightly. The Duke noticed instantly. We are not alone. Lyset stepped back toward him instinctively. From the collapsed corridor ahead, figures emerged slowly, dressed not as guards or nobles, but in plain dark coats with insignias removed. They moved with coordinated silence, surrounding the open ruin space. Idrissa exhaled once. So they finally respond directly. The Duke moved slightly in front of Lyset. How many? Enough, Idrissa said simply. Lyset's pulse tightened. They followed us. No, Idrissa corrected again. They followed me. One of the figures stepped forward and spoke calmly. Idrissa Halvorn, you have interfered beyond permitted scope. Step away from the targets. The Duke's expression hardened. Targets. The figure turned slightly toward Lyset and the Duke. Convergence subjects identified. Termination authorization pending. Lyset felt cold spread through her chest. Idrissa looked almost disappointed. You see, she said softly, they do not negotiate. The Duke's voice lowered dangerously. You led us into a trap. I led you to the truth, she corrected. Another figure raised a signal. The surrounding guards behind Lyset began to move forward, but Idrissa lifted one hand slightly. They will not harm you, she said toward Lyset and the Duke. Not yet. Lyset stared at her. Why help us at all? Idrissa's gaze softened for the first time. Because once I was also a convergence point, she said quietly, and I learned what happens when you are erased instead of understood. A sudden tension snapped through the ruins as the opposing figures began advancing. The Duke pulled Lyset closer behind a broken stone column. Stay behind me. You cannot fight all of them. I only need to delay them. Idrissa moved away from them slightly, stepping toward the center of the ruined space. This is where it stabilizes, she said aloud, almost to herself. The lead figure called out again. Final warning. Idrissa looked back one last time at Lisette. "You were never meant to survive court attention this long," she said. "So if you are still standing now, it means something within their design has already failed." Lisette's voice trembled slightly. "What happens now?" Idrissa smiled faintly again. "Now you decide whether you remain a piece in their system," she said, "or become a break in it." Before Lisette could respond, Idrissa stepped forward and triggered something beneath the ruins, a hidden mechanism activated with a deep, shifting sound. Stone cracked open beneath the attackers, splitting the ground into descending layers of old tunnels and collapsing pathways. Chaos erupted instantly. The figures scattered, shouting orders as structure failed beneath them. The Duke grabbed Lisette's arm. "Move!" They ran through narrowing passages while dust filled the air behind them. Idrissa remained behind for a moment longer, standing amid collapsing stone, as if accepting inevitability rather than resisting it. Lisette looked back once. Idrissa raised her hand slightly. Not a farewell. A signal. Then she disappeared into falling debris as the ruin sealed itself. Outside, beneath the storm breaking above the capital, Lisette and the Duke emerged into open air through a side passage hidden beneath roots and broken stone. For several seconds neither spoke. Then, Lisette finally whispered. She stayed behind. The Duke looked toward the sealed ruin. "She bought us time." Lisette's hands trembled slightly. "And now what?" The Duke turned toward her fully. Now there was no distance left between them in understanding. "Now," he said quietly, "we stop being guided." Thunder rolled across the sky as dawn began to break faintly over the capital. Somewhere inside the city, unseen systems continued moving. But for the first time since the royal ball, Lisette no longer felt like she was being carried by events she could not control. She felt awake inside them. And beside her, the Duke no longer looked like a distant figure of fear. He looked like someone who had finally been seen clearly enough to be dangerous in return. The capital changed after the ruins collapsed, though no official record ever admitted why. The royal court called it a structural failure beneath an abandoned site, nothing more than forgotten stone giving way to time. But those who had been present that night spoke in quieter voices afterward, as if even memory itself had learned caution. Lisette returned to Valamere House under heavier silence than before. The drawing was gone, the threatening letters stopped, and even the rumors that once clung to her name began to fade in a strange, unnatural way. It felt less like peace, and more like something had been deliberately removed from the world. Malin noticed it first. "They are pretending nothing happened," she said one evening, watching servants move calmly through the halls again. Lisette stood near the window, holding the same ribbon she had once dropped at the royal ball. "Or they are waiting to see what we become next." The Duke of Norcester did not appear at court for several days. When he finally did, the nobles watched him more carefully than before, as though unsure whether the man they saw now was the same one who had walked through fire and ruins without hesitation. But he did something unexpected. He stepped away from the inner circles of power, not in defeat, in refusal. Letters arrived at Valamere House without warning, never sealed with court insignias, always left unsigned. They spoke only of distance being no longer useful, and silence no longer safe. On the 7th evening after the ruins, Lisette met him once more at St. Orlande's conservatory. The glass walls shimmered beneath evening light, the same place where truth had first begun to unravel between them. "You could have taken control of the investigation," Lisette said softly. "And become what they expect," he replied. "No." Lisette studied him carefully. "Then what now?" The Duke looked toward the broken horizon of the capital, beyond the glass. Now we remain visible, he said. Not as pieces, as witnesses. A quiet pause settled between them. Lisette finally spoke again. Do you think Idrissa is truly gone? The Duke did not answer immediately. I think, he said at last, that she chose what she believed was the only way to break something larger than herself. Lisette nodded slowly, though uncertainty still lingered. And us? His gaze returned to her. We were never a mistake, he said. Only an interruption they failed to remove in time. Outside the conservatory, distant bells rang across the capital, marking the beginning of a new court cycle. But inside, nothing felt like it belonged to old systems anymore. Lisette held the ribbon in her hand a little tighter, and for the first time since the royal ball, she was not running from what had happened. Neither was he. They were simply standing inside the aftermath, where the story no longer belonged to those who planned it. It belonged to those who survived it. Now tell me honestly, after everything, do you think Lisette and the Duke will rebuild their world together? Or will the court eventually try one last time to pull them apart? And do you believe the truth behind the system was fully revealed or only partially exposed? I will be watching the comments closely, because some endings are never truly endings.